Prince Alexander stood at the grand window of the palace ballroom, watching the crowds gather in the royal gardens below. Today was the annual spring festival, and thousands of people had come to celebrate. The 8-year-old prince pressed his small hands against the cool glass, his breath fogging the window as he watched children running between the colorful tents and food stalls. The festival was always his favorite day of the year. Unlike the formal ceremonies and stuffy diplomatic meetings he usually had to attend, the spring festival felt alive and real. Common people laughed and played games, mothers chased their children, and everyone seemed genuinely happy. Alexander wished he could join them instead of watching from high above like a bird in a cage. His governess, Miss Catherine, stood behind him adjusting his formal blue velvet jacket for the 10th time that morning. "Remember, Your Highness," she said in her stern voice, "you must stay close to the royal guards at all times. The crowd will be quite large today, and your safety is our primary concern." Alexander nodded but continued staring out the window. He had heard these same warnings countless times before. Stay close to the guards, don't wander off, don't talk to strangers, don't touch anything without permission. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to be a normal child, free to explore and play without a dozen rules to follow. Captain Marcus of the Royal Guard entered the room, his polished armor gleaming in the morning sunlight. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, despite his intimidating appearance. Alexander liked him much more than the other guards who always seemed so serious and frightened of everything. "Good morning, Your Highness," Captain Marcus said with a respectful bow. "Are you ready for the festival?" Alexander turned away from the window, his face lighting up with excitement. "I've been ready since sunrise. Will we really get to walk through all the stalls? And can I try the honey cakes that the baker makes?" Captain Marcus smiled. "We'll see what we can arrange, young prince. But first, let me explain today's security arrangements." He pulled out a small map of the garden grounds and spread it on the nearby table. "We'll follow this route through the festival. 6 guards will surround you at all times, and I'll stay directly by your side." Alexander studied the map carefully. The planned route seemed to cover only the main pathways, avoiding the more interesting areas where he could see juggling performances and puppet shows set up. It looked boring and safe, just like everything else in his life. "But what about the puppet theater?" Alexander asked, pointing to a small area marked on the edge of the map. "And the magic show?" "We're not going anywhere near the fun parts." Miss Catherine stepped forward. "Your Highness, those areas will be too crowded and difficult to secure. The main pathway will give you an excellent view of the festival while ensuring your safety." Alexander's shoulders dropped in disappointment. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks, imagining all the wonderful things he might see and do. Now it seemed like it would be just another formal appearance where he would wave politely while staying safely away from any real excitement. Captain Marcus noticed the prince's disappointment and knelt down to his level. "Tell you what, Your Highness, if the crowds aren't too thick and everything goes smoothly, maybe we can make a quick stop at the puppet show. But you must promise to stay exactly where I tell you and follow every instruction immediately." Alexander's eyes widened with hope. "Really, you mean it?" "I mean it. But only if you're the most well-behaved prince in the entire kingdom today." Alexander straightened his shoulders and nodded seriously. "I promise, Captain Marcus. I'll be perfect." As they prepared to leave for the festival, Alexander couldn't contain his excitement. He practically bounced as they walked through the palace corridors toward the main entrance. The sound of music and laughter drifted in from outside, making his heart race with anticipation. The massive oak doors of the palace opened, and Alexander stepped out into the warm spring sunshine. The festival spread out before him like a magical wonderland. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze. The air smelled of fresh bread and blooming flowers, and everywhere he looked, people were smiling and enjoying themselves. The royal party began their slow procession through the gardens. Alexander waved at the children who pointed and whispered excitedly when they saw him. Some of the younger ones had never seen the prince before, and they stared with wide eyes as if he were some kind of fairy tale character come to life. As they walked past the various stalls and attractions, Alexander tried to see everything at once. Merchants called out, offering their finest goods. Performers juggled colorful balls and sang cheerful songs. The smell of roasted nuts and sweet pastries made his stomach growl, even though he had eaten a large breakfast. But even in the midst of all this joy and celebration, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was still trapped behind invisible walls. The guards formed a protective circle around him, keeping the crowds at a respectful distance. He could see the festival, but he couldn't truly be part of it. As they approached the central fountain where a small stage had been set up for performances, Alexander noticed something that made him pause. In the crowd gathered around the stage, he spotted a man who seemed different from the other festival goers. While everyone else was laughing and clapping at the performers, this man stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed not on the stage, but on Alexander himself. The man wore common clothes like any other citizen, but something about his intense stare made Alexander feel uncomfortable. There was no joy in his expression, no excitement about the festival. He simply watched the prince with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to follow every movement. Alexander glanced up at Captain Marcus, wondering if he should mention what he had noticed. But the captain was busy scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble, and Alexander didn't want to seem like a frightened child over what might be nothing at all. Alexander tried to focus on the cheerful performance happening on the small stage, but his eyes kept drifting back to the strange man in the crowd. A group of acrobats were performing amazing flips and jumps, drawing gasps of amazement from the audience. But the man never once looked at them. His dark eyes remained fixed on Alexander as if nothing else in the entire festival mattered to him. The prince shifted uncomfortably, moving slightly closer to Captain Marcus. Something about the man's stare felt wrong, like the feeling Alexander got when storm clouds gathered before a heavy rain. His instincts told him this person didn't belong here, not in the same way as all the happy families and excited children around them. Captain Marcus noticed Alexander's restlessness. "Is everything all right, Your Highness?" he asked quietly, leaning down so only the prince could hear him. Alexander hesitated. He didn't want to seem foolish or cause unnecessary alarm over what might be nothing more than his imagination. But the feeling in his stomach wouldn't go away. "There's a man by the fountain," he whispered back. "He's been staring at me since we arrived here. He doesn't look like he's enjoying the festival at all." The captain's expression immediately became more serious. Without making it obvious, he glanced in the direction Alexander had indicated. It took him a moment to spot the man among the crowd, but when he did, Marcus felt the same sense of unease that had troubled the young prince. The man was average height with brown hair and unremarkable features. He wore simple clothes that helped him blend in with the other festival goers. But his behavior was definitely unusual. While everyone around him clapped and cheered for the performers, he stood motionless, his attention completely focused on the royal party. "Good eye, Your Highness," Captain Marcus murmured. "Let's continue with our planned route, but I want you to stay very close to me. Don't look back at that man again, and act as if you're simply enjoying the festival." Alexander nodded, though his heart was now beating faster. He tried to smile and wave at the people around them, but it felt forced and unnatural. The joy he had felt earlier about the festival was quickly being replaced by worry and fear. As they moved away from the fountain area, Captain Marcus spoke quietly into a small device hidden in his collar. "Eagle 1 to all units. We have a possible surveillance subject near the central fountain. Male, approximately 30 years old, brown hair, wearing dark pants and a gray shirt. Maintain normal formation but increase alertness level." The other guards received the message through their own hidden communication devices. To any observer, they continued to look relaxed and casual, but Alexander could sense the change in their posture and attention. They were now like hunting dogs who had caught an interesting scent. The royal party continued their tour of the festival, stopping at several merchant stalls where Alexander was allowed to examine beautiful handcrafted toys and artwork. The merchants were thrilled to show their finest work to the prince, and under normal circumstances, Alexander would have been fascinated by their creativity and skill. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every few minutes, when he thought no one would notice, Alexander glanced around to see if he could spot the strange man again. At first, he didn't see him anywhere, and began to hope that perhaps the man had simply left the festival. But then, as they approached the area where various games and contests were taking place, Alexander caught sight of him again. The man had moved to a different location, positioning himself near a ring toss game where he had a clear view of the prince's path. He was no longer staring directly at Alexander, but the prince could tell he was still watching from the corner of his eye. The man was following them, staying at a distance but always keeping the royal party in sight. Alexander's chest tightened with anxiety. This was definitely not normal behavior for someone simply enjoying a festival. He tugged gently on Captain Marcus's sleeve and nodded in the direction of the suspicious man, without looking directly at him. Captain Marcus spotted the man immediately. His jaw tightened with concern. The fact that this person had deliberately moved to maintain visual contact with the prince was extremely troubling. No innocent festival goer would behave this way. Change of plans, the captain announced quietly to his team. We're going to modify our route and see if our friend follows us. If he does, we'll know for certain that he's tracking the prince. Instead of continuing toward the puppet theater as originally planned, the royal party turned left toward a quieter section of the gardens where fewer people had gathered. This area featured beautiful flower displays and peaceful walking paths, but it was away from the main festival activities. Alexander was disappointed about missing the puppet show, but he understood that Captain Marcus was testing to see what the strange man would do. If the man was simply enjoying the festival, he would have no reason to follow them to this less interesting area. They walked slowly along a path lined with blooming roses, pretending to admire the carefully maintained gardens. Alexander tried to look interested in the flowers, but his attention was focused on listening for footsteps behind them, or any sign that they were still being followed. After a few minutes, Captain Marcus spoke into his communication device again. Eagle 1 to Eagle 3, do you have visual on our subject? The response came back quickly through his earpiece. Eagle 3 to Eagle 1, confirmed. Subject has left the main festival area and is maintaining distance behind your position, approximately 50 meters back using the tree line for cover. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The man was definitely following them. This wasn't just his imagination or an overreaction to someone who happened to look in their direction. Someone was deliberately tracking their movements through the festival grounds. Captain Marcus knelt down beside Alexander, speaking in a calm voice that didn't reveal his growing concern. Your Highness, I need you to listen carefully. We're going to continue walking normally, but I want you to stay directly beside me at all times. Don't look back, and don't let anything in your expression show that you're worried. Can you do that for me? Alexander nodded, trying to appear brave even though his hands were trembling slightly. What do you think he wants? He whispered. I don't know yet, Captain Marcus replied honestly, but we're going to find out and we're going to make sure you stay safe. I promise you that. The royal party continued their slow walk through the quieter section of the gardens, but the peaceful atmosphere felt heavy with tension. Alexander tried to admire the beautiful flowers and ornate fountains they passed, but his mind was entirely focused on the knowledge that someone was following them with unknown intentions. Captain Marcus maintained his calm exterior, but inside he was calculating various options and escape routes. 20 years of experience protecting the royal family had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him that this situation was becoming dangerous. As they rounded a corner near a small gazebo surrounded by climbing ivy, one of the other guards approached Captain Marcus with urgent news. Sir, Guard Thompson whispered, we've identified a second individual who appears to be coordinating with our primary subject. He's positioned himself near the main exit of the gardens. Alexander's blood ran cold. 2 men? This was no longer just someone acting strangely at a festival. This was beginning to look like a coordinated plan of some kind. Captain Marcus's expression hardened. Descriptions? The second subject is taller, wearing a blue jacket and carrying a large bag. He's been in position near the exit for approximately 10 minutes, and he's been checking his watch repeatedly while scanning the crowd. Alexander felt like the beautiful garden around them was slowly transforming into a maze with no safe way out. The flowers that had seemed so lovely moments before now looked like places where dangerous people could hide. The peaceful paths suddenly felt like traps. What do we do now? Alexander asked in a small voice. Captain Marcus knelt down and placed a reassuring hand on the prince's shoulder. First, we stay calm. Second, we're going to take you somewhere safe while my team handles this situation. There's a secure building near the eastern wall of the gardens where palace security sometimes stays during events like this. But as they began to change direction toward the eastern wall, Alexander noticed something that made his heart race even faster. The original man they had spotted was no longer trying to hide his interest in following them. He had moved much closer and was walking directly toward them with determined steps. Captain Marcus, Alexander said urgently, he's coming this way. The captain immediately turned and saw the approaching figure. The man was still about 30 feet away, but he was closing the distance quickly and purposefully. There was no longer any pretense that this was coincidental. All units code yellow. Captain Marcus spoke into his communication device. Primary subject is approaching the package. Move to defensive positions immediately. The other guards instantly shifted into a protective formation around Alexander. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like a normal security precaution, but Alexander could feel the change in energy around him. These men were now prepared for a serious threat. The approaching man seemed to realize that his cover was blown. Instead of trying to continue acting casual, he reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was quick and deliberate, and it caused all the guards to tense up immediately. "Show me your hands," Captain Marcus called out in a commanding voice that echoed across the garden area. Several festival-goers who were nearby stopped what they were doing and turned to see what was happening. Alexander could hear confused murmurs as people tried to understand why the normally polite royal guards suddenly seemed so aggressive and alert. The suspicious man froze for a moment, his hand still inside his jacket. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sounds were the distant music from the main festival area and the gentle splashing of a nearby fountain. Then the man slowly pulled his hand out of his jacket, revealing a small black object that Alexander couldn't identify from his position. Whatever it was, it caused Captain Marcus to immediately step in front of the prince, shielding him with his own body. "Get down," the captain shouted to Alexander, pushing him behind a large stone planter filled with roses. Alexander crouched down as instructed, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the guards moving into position around him, and he could hear Captain Marcus speaking rapidly into his communication device, using codes and terms that the prince didn't understand. From his hiding place behind the planter, Alexander could see the feet and legs of the guards as they formed a protective circle. He could also see the feet of the suspicious man, who had stopped moving and seemed to be standing very still about 15 feet away. "Sir, we have visual confirmation that the object appears to be a communication device," one of the guards reported. "Possibly a radio or cell phone." "Could be a detonator," another guard replied grimly. Alexander didn't fully understand what a detonator was, but the serious tone in the guard's voice told him it was something very dangerous. He pressed himself closer to the stone planter, wishing he could somehow disappear entirely. The tense standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Alexander could hear more guards arriving from other parts of the gardens, their equipment jingling softly as they moved into position. He could also hear confused voices from festival-goers, who were being quietly moved away from the area for their own safety. "Second subject is now moving toward the primary location," came a report through Captain Marcus's earpiece. "He appears to be responding to a signal from the first subject." Alexander's mind raced with fear and confusion. What did these men want? Why were they following him? And what was going to happen next? Captain Marcus knelt down beside the planter where Alexander was hiding. "Your Highness, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 30 seconds, we're going to move you to a safer location. I want you to stay low, hold on to my belt, and don't let go no matter what happens." "Can you do that?" Alexander nodded, though his whole body was shaking now. He reached out and gripped Captain Marcus's leather belt tightly, preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. "All units, we're moving the package to secure location Beta," the captain announced. "Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, move!" Alexander held on to Captain Marcus's belt with all his strength as they began moving quickly across the garden. The world around him became a blur of green grass, stone pathways, and the legs of guards running alongside them. He kept his head down as instructed, but he could hear shouting voices behind them and the sound of more people running. The secure building that Captain Marcus had mentioned was a small stone structure that looked like a maintenance shed from the outside, but Alexander quickly discovered it was much more than that. As soon as they reached the heavy wooden door, it swung open to reveal a room filled with communication equipment and security monitors. "Get him inside, now," someone called out, and Alexander found himself being gently but firmly guided into the building. The door slammed shut behind them, and he heard the sound of multiple locks clicking into place. Inside the secure room, Alexander finally felt like he could breathe again. Captain Marcus helped him into a chair and gave him a cup of water, which he drank gratefully. His hands were still shaking and he spilled a little water on his formal jacket. But he didn't care about that anymore. "Am I safe now?" Alexander asked, looking around at the monitors that showed different views of the garden festival. "You're safe," Captain Marcus confirmed. "This building is completely secure and we have guards posted all around the perimeter. But we still need to figure out exactly what those men were planning." On one of the monitors, Alexander could see festival goers being quietly evacuated from the area where the confrontation had taken place. Security personnel in plain clothes were spread throughout the crowd, trying to maintain order while searching for the second suspicious man who had been positioned near the exit. "Have you caught them?" Alexander asked. "Not yet," Captain Marcus replied honestly. "The first man dropped his device and disappeared into the crowd when we moved you to safety. We're still tracking the second individual." Alexander studied the monitors carefully, trying to spot anything unusual among the people walking through the gardens. His young eyes were sharp, and he had always been good at noticing details that adults sometimes missed. On the monitor showing the area near the main entrance, he saw families leaving the festival early, probably worried about the commotion they had witnessed. Children were crying and parents were hurrying them along the pathways toward the parking areas outside the palace grounds. But then Alexander noticed something that made him sit up straighter in his chair. "Captain Marcus, look at monitor 3, he said urgently. The captain turned his attention to the screen that showed a view of the rose garden where they had first encountered the suspicious man. "What do you see, Your Highness?" "There." Alexander pointed at a figure partially hidden behind a large rose bush. "That man in the blue jacket? He's not leaving like everyone else. He's hiding and watching the building we're in." Captain Marcus leaned closer to the monitor and immediately saw what the prince had spotted. A man in a blue jacket was indeed concealed behind the landscaping, and he appeared to be observing the secure building. This had to be the second individual they had been tracking. "Outstanding observation, Your Highness," the captain said with genuine admiration. "You may have just helped us catch one of these suspects." He immediately radioed the information to his team. "All units, we have visual on the second subject. Rose Garden, Sector 7, behind the large bush near the memorial fountain. He's watching our current location." Alexander felt a small surge of pride despite his fear. He had actually helped the guards by noticing something important. But his satisfaction was short-lived as he continued watching the monitors and saw something else that worried him. "Captain Marcus, there's something else," he said quietly. "Look at the people leaving the festival. Some of them keep looking back at this building too." The captain examined the monitors more carefully. Alexander was right. While most people were simply hurrying away from the area, a few individuals in the crowd seemed unusually interested in the secure building. They would walk a few steps, then glance back over their shoulders, then continue walking. "How many people are involved in this?" Alexander wondered aloud. It was a question that Captain Marcus was asking himself as well. What had started as one suspicious individual had quickly become two, and now it appeared there might be even more people involved in whatever plan was unfolding. "Sir," came a voice through the communication system. "We have a situation. The subject in the rose garden just signaled to someone in the crowd using some kind of hand gesture. We think he's coordinating with additional individuals." Alexander's stomach dropped. This was getting worse and worse. How many people were out there, and what did they all want with him? Captain Marcus was now speaking rapidly with multiple teams of security personnel positioned throughout the gardens. Alexander could only hear one side of the conversations, but he could tell from the captain's tone that the situation was becoming increasingly complex. "Your Highness," Captain Marcus said, turning back to Alexander, "I need to ask you some questions. Have you noticed anyone unusual around the palace in recent days? Anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to your activities or asking questions about your schedule?" Alexander thought carefully. "There was a new gardener last week. He kept working near the windows where I have my lessons with Miss Catherine, and the cook mentioned that someone had been asking questions about what foods I like and when I usually eat my meals." Captain Marcus's expression grew more serious. "What did this gardener look like?" "He was about the same height as the man we saw today, but his hair was darker. He had a mustache too," Alexander recalled. Miss Catherine thought it was strange that he always found reasons to work in areas where he could see into the palace windows. "And the person asking about your meals?" "The cook said it was someone who claimed to be planning a special dinner for visiting dignitaries. But when she asked about it later, Nobody in the kitchen staff knew anything about any special dinner. Captain Marcus immediately relayed this information to the palace security chief. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a random incident at the festival. Someone had been planning this for days, possibly weeks, gathering information about the prince's routines and preferences. "Sir," another voice came through the communication system, "we need to consider the possibility that this is a kidnapping attempt. The coordination and planning suggest a serious criminal organization." Alexander's eyes widened with fear. Kidnapping? He had heard stories about such things happening to important people, but he had never imagined it could happen to him. Captain Marcus saw the fear in the young prince's eyes and knelt down beside his chair. "Your Highness, I want you to know that we are going to protect you no matter what. We have the best security team in the country, and we're not going to let anything happen to you." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, Captain Marcus was mentally preparing for the possibility that they might need to implement emergency evacuation procedures. As Alexander continued watching the security monitors, he began to notice patterns that the adults seemed to be missing. While Captain Marcus and his team were focused on tracking the known suspects, Alexander's young eyes spotted something different and deeply troubling. On the monitor showing the main festival area, he could see that most of the families with children had already left as planned. The remaining people were mostly adults, and many of them seemed to be moving in a coordinated way, rather than the random patterns of normal festival goers. "Captain Marcus," Alexander said quietly, "I think there are more people involved than we realized." The captain glanced at the monitors while continuing his radio communications with the security teams. "What makes you think that, Your Highness?" Alexander pointed to several different screens. "Look at how some of these people are moving. They're not really looking at the festival things anymore. They're all slowly moving toward this building, but they're trying to make it look like they're just wandering around." Captain Marcus stopped his radio conversation and gave Alexander his full attention. The prince was right. On multiple monitors, individuals who appeared to be unconnected were gradually closing in on the secure building from different directions. "How many people do you count?" the captain asked. Alexander studied the screens carefully, pointing as he counted. "At least 8, maybe more. And Captain Marcus, I think some of them have been here since the festival started. They weren't just following us today, they were already in position." This revelation sent a chill through the room. If Alexander was correct, this wasn't just a spontaneous kidnapping attempt. It was a carefully planned operation that had been set up well in advance. Captain Marcus immediately contacted the palace security chief. "Sir, we may be dealing with a much larger operation than initially assessed. The prince has identified multiple suspects who appear to be converging on our location." While the captain was coordinating with headquarters, Alexander continued studying the monitors. Something else was bothering him, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. There was a pattern or detail that his mind was trying to piece together. Then he saw it. On the monitor showing the service road behind the gardens, a plain white van had been parked in the same spot for over an hour. Alexander had noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, watching more carefully, he could see that the van's driver was using binoculars to watch the secure building. "Captain Marcus, there's a van behind the gardens," Alexander said urgently. "The driver has been watching us with binoculars." The captain looked at the monitor and immediately saw the threat. "That's our escape route," he muttered grimly. "If they have people positioned there, they're trying to cut off all our options." Alexander's heart sank as he realized the full scope of what was happening. These people had planned everything very carefully. They knew about the secure building, they knew about the escape routes, and they had positioned themselves to catch him no matter which way the guards tried to move him. But then Alexander noticed something that gave him an idea. In all the planning and coordination he was observing, there was one area that the suspects didn't seem to be watching as carefully. The old servants' tunnel that connected the secure building to the main palace had been sealed years ago. But Alexander remembered exploring it with some of the younger staff members during a game of hide-and-seek. The problem was that Alexander couldn't just tell Captain Marcus about the tunnel in a normal voice. If the suspects had listening devices or could read lips through the windows, they might overhear the plan and find a way to block that escape route too. Alexander needed to find a way to communicate this information secretly, without alerting anyone who might be watching or listening. He thought about the hand signals that Captain Marcus had taught him during their security drills. but those were designed for simple messages like yes, no, or danger. Then Alexander remembered something from his lessons with Miss Catherine about the history of royal communications. During wartime, members of the royal family sometimes used a special code based on seemingly innocent gestures and movements. It was designed to look like normal behavior while actually conveying important information. Alexander caught Captain Marcus's attention by tugging gently on his sleeve. When the captain looked down at him, Alexander began a series of careful movements. He pointed to himself, then made a small digging motion with his hands, then pointed downward toward the floor. Captain Marcus looked confused at first, but Alexander repeated the gestures more slowly. Point to himself, digging motion, point down. Then he added another gesture, drawing an invisible line from where they were sitting toward the direction of the main palace. Understanding dawned in Captain Marcus's eyes. The prince was trying to tell him about an underground passage. "Are you certain?" the captain whispered. Alexander nodded firmly and continued with his gestures. He held up his hands to show that the passage was about as wide as his outstretched arms. Then he moved his hands to indicate that it led directly to the palace basement. Captain Marcus pretended to be adjusting Alexander's jacket while he whispered, "How do we access it?" Alexander looked around the room and spotted what he was looking for. Behind a filing cabinet in the corner, there was a small metal grate near the floor that he had noticed when they first entered the building. He pointed to it with a tiny gesture, then looked back at Captain Marcus. The captain glanced at the grate and immediately understood. It was an old ventilation opening that had probably once connected to the servants' tunnel system. If Alexander was right, it might be their only way out of this trap. But even as this escape plan began to form, Alexander noticed something on the monitors that made his blood run cold. The suspects weren't just positioning themselves around the building anymore. They were starting to move closer, and some of them appeared to have weapons. "Captain Marcus," Alexander whispered. "They're coming." On the main monitor, they could see 4 men walking directly toward the secure building. They were no longer trying to hide their intentions or blend in with festival-goers. The man in the blue jacket was leading the group, and Alexander could see that he was carrying something in his hand that looked like a gun. Captain Marcus immediately activated his emergency communication system. "All units, we have armed suspects approaching the secure location. This is now a code red situation. Repeat, code red." Alexander felt his whole body trembling as he watched the men getting closer and closer to their hiding place. In just a few minutes, those dangerous people would reach the building where he and Captain Marcus were trapped. But Alexander's mind was also working furiously. He had figured out an escape route that the suspects didn't know about. Now he just had to help Captain Marcus understand exactly how to use it before it was too late. Captain Marcus moved quickly to the filing cabinet and examined the metal grate that Alexander had indicated. It was old and slightly rusty, but when he applied pressure, it shifted enough to confirm that there was indeed a space behind it. The prince had been absolutely correct about the hidden passage. "Your Highness, you may have just saved our lives," the captain whispered as he began working to loosen the grate. "But we need to move fast." On the monitors, they could see that the armed suspects had reached the perimeter of the secure building. 2 men were positioning themselves at the front door, while the other 2 were moving around to cover the back exit. Alexander's heart pounded as he realized they had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before the building would be completely surrounded. Captain Marcus spoke rapidly into his communication device. "All units, the package and I are implementing emergency evacuation protocol. We'll be using the old service tunnel system. I need immediate backup at the palace basement level to secure our exit point." As the captain worked to remove the grate, Alexander kept watching the monitors. What he saw next made him grab Captain Marcus's arm urgently. "Captain, look at monitor 4. On the screen showing the area near the white van, Alexander had spotted something that changed everything. A 5th man had emerged from the vehicle, and he was carrying what looked like a large rifle. But more importantly, this man looked exactly like the suspicious gardener who had been watching the palace windows the week before. Except now he didn't have a mustache. "That's him," Alexander whispered excitedly. "That's the fake gardener, but he shaved off his mustache to disguise himself." Captain Marcus looked at the monitor and immediately understood the significance of what Alexander had discovered. This man with the rifle was clearly the leader of the operation. He was the one who had been gathering intelligence about the prince's daily routines, and now he was positioning himself to be the final threat if the other suspects failed to capture Alexander. Eagle 1 to all units. Captain Marcus radioed. Priority target identified. Male with rifle near the white van, approximately 40 meters from the rear of the secure building. This subject has been conducting surveillance on the palace for at least 1 week. The response came back immediately. Copy that, Eagle 1. We have multiple sniper teams moving into position, but they need clear identification of the target before they can engage. Alexander watched as the man with the rifle moved to a position behind some trees where he had a clear view of both the secure building and the path leading back to the main palace. From that location, he would be able to shoot at anyone trying to escape, no matter which route they took. We have to go now, Captain Marcus said as he finally managed to remove the grate completely. The tunnel opening is just big enough for us to crawl through. But as Alexander prepared to enter the tunnel, he realized they faced a serious problem. Once they were in the underground passage, Captain Marcus wouldn't be able to communicate with his security teams. The other guards wouldn't know exactly where the man with the rifle was positioned, and they might not be able to stop him before he could shoot at Alexander. Alexander's mind raced as he tried to think of a solution. Then he remembered something from his history lessons about military communications during emergencies. Sometimes soldiers would use signals that could be seen from a distance to coordinate attacks or warn their allies about enemy positions. Captain Marcus, Alexander whispered. Before we go into the tunnel, I need to help your men find the right target. What do you mean, Your Highness? Alexander pointed to the window of the secure building. If I make a signal that your snipers can see, can they tell which person I'm pointing at? Captain Marcus considered this carefully. It's possible, but it would be extremely dangerous. You'd have to expose yourself in the window, and if any of the suspects see you, they'll know exactly where we are. Alexander's stomach was filled with butterflies. But he knew this might be their only chance to stop the man with the rifle before he could hurt someone. I have to try. Your men need to know which person is the most dangerous. Captain Marcus hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. All right, but we'll do this very carefully. I'll position you at the edge of the window where you'll be visible to our snipers, but hopefully not to the suspects who are close to the building. Alexander nodded and moved to the window. Through the glass, he could see the man with the rifle clearly. The fake gardener was now crouched behind a large oak tree, adjusting his weapon and preparing to take aim at the escape routes. Captain Marcus radioed his sniper teams. All eagle eyes watch the secure building window. The package will provide target identification in 10 seconds. Alexander took a deep breath and stepped into view at the window. He raised his right hand and pointed directly at the man behind the oak tree. But pointing wasn't enough. There were several trees in that area, and the snipers might not be able to tell exactly which person he meant. So Alexander did something that Captain Marcus hadn't expected. He began making the same digging motion with his hands that he had used earlier to indicate the tunnel. Then he touched his upper lip where a mustache would be, and finally pointed again at the man with the rifle. The gestures told a complete story. This is the man who was digging for information by pretending to be a gardener. He used to have a mustache, and he's the target you need to focus on. Brilliant, Captain Marcus whispered. Absolutely brilliant. Through their communication system, they heard the sniper team leader respond. Eagle Eyes 1 has clear visual on target. Male subject behind oak tree. Position confirmed by package identification. Ready to engage on your command. But just as Alexander stepped back from the window, one of the suspects near the front door spotted his movement. The man shouted something to his companions and pointed at the window where Alexander had been standing. They know we're here, Captain Marcus said grimly. Into the tunnel now. Alexander crawled into the opening behind the filing cabinet, just as they heard the sound of the suspects trying to break down the front door of the secure building. The tunnel was dark and narrow, but Alexander could feel air moving through it, which meant it definitely led to another opening. As they crawled through the dusty passage, they could hear Captain Marcus coordinating the final phase of the operation through his radio. All units, packages in motion through alternate route. Engage all targets on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Execute! Even from inside the tunnel, Alexander could hear the sound of the security teams taking action above ground. There were shouts, running footsteps, and what sounded like the capture of multiple suspects. But Alexander also heard one more sound that made him freeze in the tunnel. The sharp crack of a rifle shot from the direction of the oak tree. The sound of the rifle shot echoed through the tunnel, making Alexander's heart stop for a terrifying moment. Had someone been hurt? Had the sniper teams been able to stop the fake gardener in time? Captain Marcus urged him to keep crawling forward through the narrow passage. But Alexander's mind was filled with worry about what was happening above ground. After what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, they reached the end of the tunnel. Captain Marcus pushed open another old grate, and they emerged into the basement of the main palace. Alexander had never been so happy to see the familiar stone walls and ancient wooden beams of his home. Immediately, palace security guards surrounded them, helping them out of the tunnel and checking to make sure they were both uninjured. Alexander's formal blue jacket was now dusty and torn from crawling through the underground passage, but he didn't care about his appearance at all. "Report," Captain Marcus demanded as soon as they were safely in the palace basement. "Sir, all suspects have been captured," came the immediate response from the security team leader. "Your target identification was perfect. We were able to neutralize the sniper before he could harm anyone. The rifle shot we heard was him firing into the air as he was tackled by our agents." Alexander felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. Nobody had been hurt, and all the dangerous people had been caught. His hidden gesture at the window had actually worked. The security teams had been able to identify and stop the most dangerous suspect because of his quick thinking. "What about the other men?" Alexander asked. "All 8 suspects are now in custody," the security leader reported. It turns out this was a very sophisticated kidnapping operation that had been planned for over 2 months. The fake gardener was indeed the leader, and he had been gathering detailed information about Your Highness's schedule and security procedures. Captain Marcus knelt down beside Alexander and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your Highness, I want you to know that your actions today probably saved lives. Your observation skills, your knowledge of the palace's hidden passages, and especially your creative communication under pressure were extraordinary." Alexander felt proud, but also exhausted. The fear and tension of the past hour had drained all his energy. "Is the festival over?" he asked sadly, realizing that his special day had been completely ruined by these dangerous people. "The festival area has been cleared for security reasons," Captain Marcus admitted. "But Your Highness, I think we can arrange something special for you. Would you like to meet some of the security team members who helped protect you today? They're all very impressed with how brave and smart you were." Alexander's face lit up a little. He had always been curious about the men and women who worked so hard to keep the royal family safe, but he rarely got to talk with them directly. As they made their way upstairs to a secure conference room, Alexander learned more about what had happened during the crisis. The investigation had revealed that the kidnapping plot was part of a larger criminal organization that had been planning to demand a huge ransom from the royal treasury. The fake gardener had spent weeks learning Alexander's routines, and the group had chosen the Spring Festival as their opportunity because they knew the prince would be outside the heavily secured palace walls. "The most impressive part," one of the security agents told Alexander, "was how you figured out that we needed to identify the specific target. Most adults wouldn't have thought to communicate that information under such dangerous circumstances." Alexander learned that his gestures at the window had been recorded by the security cameras, and they would become part of the official training materials for future palace security operations. His quick thinking had shown how clear communication could make the difference between success and failure in a crisis. Later that evening, after Alexander had been thoroughly checked by the palace doctor and had changed into comfortable clothes, his parents returned from their diplomatic trip. They had been contacted immediately about the incident and had rushed back to the palace as quickly as possible. "We are so proud of you," his mother said, hugging him tightly. "Captain Marcus told us everything you did to help keep yourself and others safe." His father added, "You showed incredible courage and intelligence today, son. But most importantly, you trusted the people whose job it is to protect you, and you worked with them as a team." That night, as Alexander lay in his bed thinking about everything that had happened, he realized that the day had taught him something important about being a prince. It wasn't just about wearing fancy clothes and waving at crowds during festivals. Sometimes it meant staying calm under pressure, thinking clearly when others were afraid, and finding ways to help protect the people around him. The next morning, Alexander woke up to find a special surprise waiting for him. Captain Marcus had arranged for a private festival in the palace courtyard, complete with puppet shows, magic performances, and all the honey cakes Alexander could eat. The performers were all palace staff members and their families, and everyone celebrated not just the arrival of spring, but also Alexander's bravery during the crisis. "This is much better than the big festival," Alexander declared, watching a cook perform juggling tricks while the palace gardener, the real one, told funny stories to a group of children. As he enjoyed his private celebration, Alexander noticed that the security guards seemed more relaxed and friendly than usual. They no longer looked at him as just someone who needed to be protected. Now they looked at him as someone who could be trusted to help in difficult situations. Captain Marcus approached Alexander as he was watching the puppet show. "Your Highness, I have a question for you. Would you be interested in learning some additional security procedures and communication techniques? After yesterday, I think you've shown that you're ready for more advanced training." Alexander's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Really? You mean I could learn the same things that real security agents know? Within reason, of course. But yes, I think it would be valuable for you to understand more about how we work to keep everyone safe." Alexander nodded enthusiastically. The frightening experience at the festival had shown him that danger could appear unexpectedly, but it had also shown him that he was capable of staying calm and thinking clearly when it mattered most. He was ready to learn how to be even more helpful in protecting himself and others. As the private festival continued around him, Alexander felt a new sense of confidence and purpose. He was still a young prince who loved puppet shows and honey cakes, but he was also someone who could be counted on when things got serious. And that made him feel very proud indeed.